Hello and welcome to Iowa Learning Farm's virtual field day today. We're pleased to have you with us. This is being recorded, so if you have to jump off for any reason, please know that you can catch up later today as this gets posted to our website. Thank you to everyone who has attended a virtual field day over the past 2 years. We're grateful to have you join us. We do have some field day footage that we recorded earlier this year that'll kick off our presentation today. For those of you that are new and joining us for the first time, a little bit about the Iowa Learning Farms. We were established in 2004, and our goal is to build a culture of conservation by working with farmers, landowners, and researchers to implement practices that improve water quality and soil health while remaining profitable. This is all made possible through great partnerships with the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture, the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, US EPA Section 319, Conservation Districts of Iowa, Iowa Farm Bureau, Practical Farmers of Iowa, GrowMark, Iowa Agriculture Water Alliance, Iowa Corn, and the Iowa Nutrient Research Center. So just a bit of housekeeping as we're getting started here. I do ask that you remain muted with your cameras off during the video portion of today, but once the video is done playing, you're invited to either submit your questions via the chat at any time, and I'll get those asked of Allison and Mark, or you can ask to unmute and ask your question to them directly. So as I mentioned, this is being recorded, and you'll be getting a link to this recording following today's virtual field day, as well as a link to our evaluation. So this is a 5-minute process. We ask for your feedback as we continue to improve these virtual field days. So our topics today are cover crops, do's and don'ts, lessons learned about cover crops, corn growth, diseases, and pests. Our presenters today are Dr. Alison Robertson, professor and extension field pathologist in agronomy at Iowa State, and Dr. Mark Licht, assistant professor, and extension cropping system specialist in agronomy as well here at Iowa State. So again, feel free to submit your questions at any time to the chat, and we'll get started with our video.
Hello, I'm Mark Licht. I'm an assistant professor and extension cropping systems agronomist. Today we're out here looking at some cover crops that Alison Robertson is using with an experiment that she's got funded for. Alison, can you tell us a little bit about this experiment and what we're looking at?
Sure, Mark. Thanks for having me out here today. So this is an experiment where we're looking at the effect of planting corn into a green rye cover crop on the corn itself, right? And so this is an experiment that's been funded by the USDA NIFA, and it's led by a couple of guys out on the East Coast, Stephen Mirsky and Chris Rehberg-Horton. Stephen is at USDA IRS, and Chris Rehberg-Horton is at North Carolina State University. And the really cool thing about this trial is that this exact same trial is being done at 15 other states across the United States. And so what we're doing is we're terminating the cover crops at different times before planting the corn, and then after planting the corn, and we're looking at the effect of those termination dates of the rye on not only diseases, which would be my area of interest, right, but also on insects, not only insect pests, but also beneficial pests, and then of course weeds. So we're kind of looking at this planting green from a pest management scenario.
So Alison, I know you've done cover crop research for many years. What would you expect to see from this trial as far as results?
So we actually have done almost this identical trial the past 2 years, also with funding from the USDA. And in that trial, we worked with Practical Farmers of Iowa. So we had a small plot trial like this. And then last year, 2020 and 2021, we'll be working with Practical Farmers of Iowa, and we'll be working on 4 commercial farms and collecting data on the effect of planting green on those farms. But we finished up our small plot experiment, and basically what we found was that corn does not like to be planted green. So I know that a lot of farmers are planting soybeans green, and there doesn't seem to be an effect at all. But when we plant corn into green rye, it takes longer to emerge, it's less vigorous, and we tend to see, well, at least in our small plot experiment that we did, we saw a greater yield loss when we planted the corn green as opposed to terminating the rye crop before planting the corn.
So we've done research together, and so I know from that it's all about the amount of biomass that we get, right?
Yes, I agree with you.
So what are some of the effects that we have when we have too much biomass, whether it's planting green or even if we try to terminate ahead of planting?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, right? We have tons of questions about that. So, but I totally agree with you that I think it has a lot to do with how much biomass is there. So when we think in terms of, like, if I think in terms of as a plant pathologist, right, the more biomass we have above the ground, the more root biomass we're going to have. Those roots are going to be infected with these pathogens that can then jump over onto the corn. So we have more root biomass, so probably more inoculum in the soil that we're planting the corn into. And then the other thing is that the biomass, you know, kind of carpets the soil, right? Which is great if you're managing weeds. But when we think about pathogens, we're just keeping that soil cooler, we're keeping it wetter, and that's exactly what Pythium likes. They want cool and wet. And so I think that combination, if I can talk about the disease triangle that everyone teases me about, I mean, that disease triangle, we have more pathogen, we have more favorable environment, and so I think we have a greater chance of getting seedling disease.
So you've done some socially distanced spacing of rye from the corn row.
Yes.
And I'm gonna ask you to extrapolate on that a little bit, because I think about if we can plant the rye outside of that corn row, could we potentially plant green into the socially distanced rye?
Yeah, so that is something that we're hoping to get funding for. So we're applying for funding for that now, but that's exactly what we're thinking, is that if we can, you know, just like if we stand 6 feet away, you know, we have a lower risk of getting COVID or just a common cold. That's exactly the same as what we found in our research with the corn, was that if we separated the corn from the rye, we saw less of an effect of the rye on that corn. And in actual fact, the yields were similar between a no cover crop and planted away. And then, so we're thinking that we can then let that rye grow bigger for more time. And so then a farmer could, yes, come and plant his corn and then terminate his rye afterwards. So yeah, plant green in a socially distanced setting.
So we're out here on a nice brisk day, you know, a nice breeze, not too bad, but it's a little on the chillier side, right? We're standing in some plots that were terminated. Do you want to talk just a little bit about some of the challenges with spring management? And, you know, this year planting green seems more realistic than other years. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure, although I'm a pathologist and you're an agronomist, but yeah, I mean, if right now it's, you know, what are we, middle of April? And so, you know, it's probably a long way in everybody's memory now, but we've just come through 3 weeks of pretty cold weather. And so, I mean, that's one of the reasons why we're looking at planting green, and we're so interested in planting green, is because if you do, our recommendation from a seedling disease point of view is to terminate that rye, you know, 10 to 14 days before you plant. Well, this rye was terminated probably about 10 days ago, and it was pretty cold, and you can see that it's just taking a long, I mean, it looks like it's dying, and hopefully it will, but it's just going really slowly. And so, yeah, I mean, that's the big question, is in a spring like this here, when it's cold for so long, and you can't get in to terminate your cover crop, then what other management could you use to get in and plant your corn and then still terminate that cover crop?
Yeah, because this rye is roughly 8 inches tall,
Yeah.
and yeah, we've been cooler, right?
Yeah.
And so the general thought of trying to put out glyphosate onto it, maybe using some adjuvants, to help with activity,
Yeah.
but if it's cold and the plant's not, translocating that glyphosate, it's just not going to terminate as well. As we wrap up here today, what are the big outcomes that you think come from doing research like this, and all the other research that you've done as well?
In Iowa, where we have this corn soybean system, that where we're growing crops for 4 or 5 months of the year, I think that cover crops add to the value of agriculture and also of the environment here in Iowa. And so I think that they definitely have a role to play. So just increasing the time that the ground is covered with green cover. We know that they do enormous help in terms of just protecting against soil erosion, improving water infiltration. We're starting to learn a lot more about how the roots and the organisms associated with them can improve soil health. So yeah, I know that there's not a lot grown on the landscape in Iowa, but I certainly hope that with our research, we can provide best management practices to farmers who are interested in growing cover crops, and maybe not even interested, but want to benefit their farms, benefit their soil health. And so how can they start to incorporate cover crops into their farm easily and efficiently, with the least amount of headaches possible.
All right. And an apology and correction, Dr. Robertson is actually in the plant pathology and microbiology department, not agronomy, as I originally stated. So we're pleased to have both she and Mark here with us today. So with that, I'll turn it over to them to maybe share a little bit more before we get some questions.
Yeah, so a lot happened through this last growing season. So what I'm going to first point out is when we shot that video, and while I was playing, I looked up the date. It was April 23rd, a long time ago, right? And so we did have a cold, wet spring, and I was thinking, as Allison was talking about those cover crops being terminated 10 days prior to that, I was hoping that they would have been a little bit yellower, but you could just barely see, in the ones that got terminated, that they were just starting to turn yellow. So yeah, so that's kind of where I would start with, and then maybe point toward Allison and ask if she wanted to just give a quick summary on some of that previous work.
Hi, Mark. Yeah, so I remember that day. It was cold and wet, and then it took a while for that glyphosate to take effect on those trials. I can give you an update on those trials. They were successfully established in 15 states across the US, which was great. And there are 3 postdocs on the trial who are now capturing all that data and analyzing it. I can tell you that we did a little bit of extra research in Texas, Pennsylvania, and Kentucky, I believe. Yep, Kentucky. And what was interesting was down in Texas, we saw more disease in the planting green treatments, just like we see here in Iowa. But out in Kentucky and Pennsylvania, we did not see a effect on disease. And we were also looking at the Pythium populations as well. And so they corresponded to disease levels. And so that's kind of interesting, and just brings us back around to that whole disease triangle, right? We're looking at very different environments across those 4 states. In Texas, they had a lot of biomass, And we had pretty good biomass here in Iowa. I have not seen the biomass data for Pennsylvania and Kentucky. And so I'm kind of interested to see what's going on there, because as we were talking about in the video, right, we were wondering about biomass. And so, but yeah, I mean, we're processing that data. We did some on-farm trials this year with practical farmers of Iowa. Again, just waiting for that data to come in and see if what we were seeing in those small plot trials we're seeing elsewhere in the US and then elsewhere in Iowa, right, on commercial farms. Did I answer your question, Mark?
Yes, yes. It's always good to have a little bit of a status update when we recorded the video earlier, so.
Yes, yeah.
And actually, Alison, someone was curious where those other states were, or what other states are participating.
So you know what, I actually have a slide right here. So I can share my screen, right, Liz?
Yes.
Yeah, so let me share my screen, and then that's easier than me remembering where those states are. Helps if I push share, but can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, so so Texas and then Iowa. So I'm leading the plant pathology. John Tooker is leading the entomology part. Colleen Chase is leading the weed part. But you can see the all the states taking part. And then this is Stephen Mirsky and Chris Reberg Horton, who I mentioned at the beginning, who are leading this project. And there is a project website here if you want to go and have a look. So those are the 15 states that are taking part. So, and with the trial that we spent a year setting this trial up. And I'm going to stop my share now. Yeah, and so we have tried to be as consistent as possible across all the locations. So sure, our hybrids will vary a little bit, and it's possible that our cereal rye variety also varies, but essentially we have basically the same termination dates, and then we're collecting, we have, you know, we're doing everything as standardized as possible to rule out any other factors that could confound the data.
Someone was curious, ahead of corn, would there be an advantage to plant a clover or other legume as the cover crop to lessen the potential pathogen impact of the cereal rye?
So that's an excellent question. And I did some work with Tom Casper a couple of years back where we used camelina. And so we had a corn soybean rotation, and then we planted camelina or cereal rye before corn and camelina or cereal rye before soybeans. And we did find far less disease in the corn following the camelina. And so, yes, it's likely that if we planted a non-grass rye crop, non-grass cover crop before corn, that we could decrease the amount of disease. I guess the interesting thing is that the pathogens that are causing disease on corn they have a very wide host range, and so it's likely that they could cause disease on the non-grass cover crop. And so that kind of hints at there's something else also going on here, right? That it's not just the fact that cereal rye is a host of these pathogens. There's some other factors that are increasing this risk of disease. And some of those factors could be, Mark and I have talked about these tons of times, allelopathy, nitrogen immobilization, because those grass crops will, you know, have a higher carbon nitrogen ratio. So those are a couple of ideas that we've had and that we're trying to work on. But that's a great question. And yeah, I mean, I think, you know, a clover or something like that before the corn would reduce that risk of seedling disease.
So I would agree with what Alison has said, obviously, because she was involved in it, right? So But one of the things I wanted to jump in with is, unfortunately, the clovers or vetches, or even if you think of things like camelina or radishes or turnips, those types of things, they take longer to get established in the fall. And so seeding them ahead of corn, but following soybeans, you're still going to be run pretty tight on time to be able to get them established well enough to overwinter. And so that's one of the challenges with those other species, that they don't necessarily overwinter that well, or they take a little bit more growth to be able to get to an overwintering stage. And so I think normally we talk about needing probably 6 weeks. If it's on the cooler side, we may even need, up to 8 weeks to get that good growth.
So Mark, I have a question about that. Do you think, how much, like, I remember with camelina, we didn't get a whole lot of biomass in the spring compared to the rye, right? And so if we're planting cover crops for that biomass, for that ground cover in the spring, would we have enough with the clover or the camelina, assuming that we got it established well enough in the fall?
You would likely, well, so it's a relative thing, right? And so I think even with rye or any of the legumes, the fall growth is really going to determine and dictate how much spring growth you get, right? But just comparing, a cereal rye with a vetch or a clover or camelina, no, those legumes generally are not going to produce near as much biomass as a cereal rye.
And if you wouldn't mind, Allison, when you get a chance to put that project link there, someone had asked for that
Yes,
to follow up with it.
I'm doing it right now. So.
Wonderful. And so you mentioned that you set up the trial for a year. What was your targeted seeding rates and dates for that cereal rye?
So we, for this project, one of the things that we asked all the collaborators to do was, especially our northern collaborators, was to plant an early maturing soybean so that we could get in and plant that rye, like in Iowa. I want to say that what our goal was to plant it the first week of September. And I'm pretty sure we got it in around about the first week of September, maybe the second week of September, because we wanted to make sure we got good establishment. And then what was our seeding rate? I would think that it was probably, I don't have the seeding rate. I think we went in at 60 pounds an acre. I actually have my postdoc on the call. She might have that information. Rochelle might be able to type it into the message box and correct me. So.
And that, if that's the case, that's pretty typical for seeding rates here in Iowa, right, Mark?
Yeah, 60 pounds of cereal rye is pretty common. I think the NRCS has maybe changed some of their guidelines, and so there is some ability maybe to reduce those seeding rates a little bit. And I honestly don't see any problem with reducing the seeding rates as long as you get good establishment on that cereal rye, because it's going to want to produce tillers in the fall. And so if you get it established early enough, it'll produce more tillers to make up for a lower seeding rate.
And didn't we find that in some previous research that we did, Mark, was that you could get away with a lower seeding rate and still get pretty good biomass? Yeah,
another study we had 3 different seeding rates, and essentially all the seeding rates had about the same amount of spring biomass produced. And we ranged from, I think there was a 70-pound range on those seeding rates from high to low, if I remember correctly.
Oh, okay. So Rochelle did type in, it was 86 pounds. So it's pretty high comparatively.
Well, and depending on what you're looking for, right? So I've been talking a lot in the last 3 months about, the success of cover crops is dependent on the amount of biomass you're producing, right? And so if you're looking for forage, or if you're looking for weed suppression, there's good reason to want to put out more seeds per acre. And so And I'm sure Allison and others that are doing pathology research with cover crops, the more biomass you have out there, probably the more pathogen you have too, I would guess.
Yep, yes, I would agree. And so the thing about this study, this multi-state study to remember as well, is that we're not only looking at pathogens, right? We're looking at weed control, and we're also looking at insect management, and not only insect pests, like armyworms, but Rochelle was also out there during the growing season installing these little traps in the plots with little worms on pins. And then we were counting, insect predators and how many of those mealyworms were eaten. So yeah.
Are you able to share out any of those results yet in terms of pests?
Well, I can tell you about Iowa that we just didn't have a whole lot of pests. So we didn't. So one of the things that we do in the trial is that we do use seed treatments on the corn, but there's no insecticide. So it's only fungicide. And the reason why we don't use insecticides is because that can impact insects in the trial, both beneficial and insect pests. And so there was no insecticide on the corn seed. We also have much larger plots than we usually use for plant disease, because insects move a lot more than pathogens. So yeah, I mean, we did everything we could to get some insect damage, but we didn't have any problems with armyworms or any pests. And we also had traps out in the field to check for slug damage, because further out east, they'll get slug damage. And we didn't find any slugs either. So yeah, and then obviously with all that biomass, we're getting excellent weed control. So this trial's kind of like, it's a balance, right? Because, with the higher biomass or the planting green, we're going to get really good weed control. And probably help with some of those insect pests. Whereas with that high biomass and that planting green, we're going to probably see more seedling disease and could have an effect on some other insects. So, yeah. Rochelle concurs. No slugs, no cutworm, no armyworm. So it was a little bit boring from that point of view. And I guess, I mean, like I said, the postdocs are getting the data in now. And so I know that we haven't heard from the rest of the states yet. We have our meeting in the first week of January, unfortunately. We were supposed to have it a couple of weeks ago, and then it got moved. So I would have had some data, but the postdocs will be sharing data there. I know that some people did have slug problems out east, as you might expect, but for us here, no slug problems.
So if people want to plant green, they're deciding, or they have to plant green because of weather conditions, what would be your recommendations for nutrient management, Mark?
Oh, for nutrient management, planting green. So I think one of the bigger things, and I think we're learning a little bit of this through research, but it's mostly anecdotal, is a little bit of starter fertilizer is going to be a little bit beneficial, especially if you can add a little bit of nitrogen there, largely just so that way you can help get that seed up and going. And then putting on the remainder of that shortly after you've got a good termination. Just again, making sure that you have the fertility out there on the corn nitrogen side of things. Phosphorus, potassium, really not much of an issue there, because that is cycling back relatively quickly through the system. And so as long as we have optimal to having those optimal soil test categories will really help us make sure that we have good growth out of it. So yeah, I don't think we need to change much. I don't think we need to increase our nitrogen rates any. It's just a matter of the timing of when we do it, I think.
Someone was curious, Allison, if you have any, or maybe Rochelle too, any suggested resources to learn more on the balance between pest to predator insect populations in field crops? or someone to connect them with?
Yes, if you would like to send me an email, there's a couple of publications from John Tooker at Pennsylvania State, but he would be the best person to talk with. So yeah, send me an email and I can send you his email, or you could look him up. So Tooker, Tooker, and then he's at Penn State University.
Great. Another question came in. Other than the environmental and soil health benefits from cover crops, are there any economic benefits to the landowner from planting cover crops? Have there been any studies on the economics, return on investment, etc.? So this one I'll probably field to Mark there.
I was going to say, Mark, you can do this one.
I was thinking about Alejandro and Wendong over in the Department of Economics. So there's been a number of economic studies done, I'll say, looking at the cost of inputs and what that does to corn and soybean yields, that type of thing. Those studies are pretty conclusive, at least right now, in that just adding in that cover crop is generally not a good return on investment initially, anyhow. I know that Alejandro has done some work that if we can start getting forage value out of it, then that's when we do start to get some positive return on investment. But again, that's more on the production side of it. And the question on kind of from a land value side of it, I don't think they've really got to that point yet, where they've been able to quantify, I'll say the long-term value of cover crops on that land value.
So some work that we did updating Dr. Duffy's work in the Department of Econ also did the value of protecting soil erosion, and it was about $6 a ton. So if you can keep that soil in place from year to year, you can keep that value on the landscape. And a lot of that is in your nutrient value as well. So this one's for both of you, or maybe one of you wants to take it first, but do either of you have trials or thoughts on seeding cereal rye directly after soybean harvest, followed by a strip till pass with fertilizer about 4 to 6 weeks after the harvest? And would the strip till be beneficial in keeping the rye out of the furrow and lessen the problems with planting the corn green?
So maybe I'll start because I've actually because I've actually done that. We basically overseeded into the soybeans, and then late October, early November, we strip tilled into that cereal rye cover crop. In the spring, just observation, for the most part, that strip till zone did not have much cover crop there. There was, a plant here and there type thing, but it wasn't nearly as thick as it was between the strip till berms. So it can be done pretty effectively as far as creating that seed bed without any cereal rye in it. Now, unfortunately, my study didn't truly, well, I guess we did, Alison did. She looked at seedling diseases in it as I think through this, right? So I'm going to actually let her respond on kind of what the seedling diseases may have looked like. But then I'm going to prompt her because she also has some additional work where she's done the socially distancing of cereal rye just by plugging tubes on the grain drill. So you have a zone, so to speak, a no-tilled zone to plant that following crop into.
Yes, so Mark, you're correct. We collected seedling disease data from your strip tills. I am not sure that we saw a significant effect on disease. I think that we did see less root rot where we planted into the strip till areas as opposed to where we had just planted into the broadcast, right? So there was less disease there, but it wasn't necessarily significant. However, I do think that strip tilling is going to help reduce that negative effect you know, the seedling disease effect on the corn, but also the negative, you know, any negative effects that rye could have on that early corn growth and development. And the reason why I say that is because of the socially distant experiment what we did. So basically in that experiment, you know what? I have another slide, so I'm going to share that slide because I like to talk from pictures. I just find it easier. So this is some work that we finished off just this past year. But so what we did here was we had corn planted into no rye cover crop, right? And then we had a rye cover crop where we drilled it on 30-inch rows, and so that it would be 15 inches on either side of the corn row, right? And so that's that second picture there. We were a little bit off center in 2020. And then we had another treatment where we drilled the rye in 7.5-inch rows, but we plugged out one of the drills so that every fourth row was just there was no rye put down. So that meant that we had three rows of rye in between the two corn rows. So the corn was about 3.5 inches away from that rye, which would be pretty similar to strip till, right? And then we have our other control where we just broadcast the rye into, I don't think, actually we didn't broadcast it, we just drilled it, but we made sure we had all the drills going. And so what we found was that there was reduced seedling disease and Pythium, the pathogen that's responsible for that seedling disease, in the radicals of the corn as that distance increased. And then we also saw a benefit of planting that corn away from that rye, in that we saw, you know, better shoot dry weight at V3, and also plant height, more vigorous seedlings. And then also we reduced that yield drag that so often occurs. And so, you know, so I mean, that would be, I think that strip till would be one great way just to reduce that risk of seedling disease on the corn and help with that planting green, right? If we could letting that rye go a little bit longer, and then having that area where there's no rye growing because it's been strip tilled or planted that way. And because once I think, like as I mentioned before, I don't think it's only the Pythium, right? I think just it also has something just to do with that decomposition of the rye residue right there where the corn seed is planted, and then also some
for detail.
Okay.
And so he's been trying to figure out if she.
There we go. Sorry about that.
That's okay. So I think I got everything out. So yeah, I mean, I think that strip till's a good idea just to reduce any negative effects of that rye on the corn. Is that what you saw in your trial, Mark, when you looked at corn growth and development?
Yep.
Worried about
It followed the same.
putting too much on top of Ann.
Yep.
So we have folks joining us from outside of Iowa as well, even from friends up north in Canada. The question is, why not switch to winter wheat? And it's potentially less impact on.
You know, we could always lean up,
So
consider a detail.
So winter wheat it's still a cereal grain, and so Alison can speak to if it would still be a host for some of those pathogens. My guess would be yes.
Yes.
The other part of the issue is that at least the winter wheat that we have available to us in northern Iowa does not overwinter as reliably as it would in southern Iowa. And so we can have some winter hardiness issues, I'll call it, because it doesn't necessarily winter kill. It's just you lose parts of the stand in various places of the field more so. And part of that's just due to ice buildup and snow cover and things like that.
Yeah, and we've done a little bit of work in the growth chambers where we've been looking at you know, comparing corn after wheat, corn after rye, and corn after some other small grains. And we still see that kind of negative effect on that corn and increased seedling disease. Wheat is also a host of Pythium and Fusarium.
Someone's curious, has there been any nitrogen rates studies in corn following a rye cover crop at different biomass levels?
At different biomass levels. So that one, I don't know about the biomass levels. The one trial I'm thinking about here in Iowa, John Sawyer did a couple, well, it's probably been more than a couple of years ago now. And I know he had it over multiple years. And so I would guess that from one year to the next, he had different biomass. And I know from, you know, his work that, you know, that's the work that I referenced about, you know, we probably don't need to be changing the total nitrogen rate, but rather just changing, you know, when we're applying it type thing. Because yeah, he did not see any differences on the agronomically optimum nitrogen rate, you know, with and without cover crops.
We submitted a grant this year that would have kind of answered that question, because it's something we're very interested in. Unfortunately, it did not get funded, so we'll try again next year. But that's a great question. I mean, it's like the one thing that I just keep thinking about: biomass and nitrogen. And yeah, is there a sweet spot there somewhere?
Yep.
Yeah. This biomass is definitely key to erosion protection, potentially
Yes.
weed suppression.
Exactly.
A lot of things.
Yeah, you're so right. So it's kind of scary, a pathologist thinking about biomass and nitrogen, but this one is.
Well, it's all because we start talking about what are the interactions between the three look like, and you know, the biomass is a good predictor that we're, you know, where we're headed with disease and nitrogen things, but yet we don't truly understand the mechanism and what's going on there.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when I started this work, you know, 7 years ago with Tom Casper, I thought it would just be pretty straightforward, and it just opened up a can of worms. So.
And I know a lot of that research actually was incorporated into a publication resource that is available through Iowa State. And I know, Mark, you've got a slide to help show people what that is.
Yeah, so I actually decided to add a second one on top of it here. So the one that Liz was referencing is that Whole Farm Conservation Best Practices Manual, and in the red bar down below is the link to the extension store where you can actually get some copies if you want. And so that one was it was done through a partnership grant through the NRCS, and we had a whole bunch of folks from the NRCS, Iowa State, Iowa Soybean, Practical Farmers of Iowa, Iowa Ag Water Alliance, and USDA scientists like Tom Casper. So there's a lot of people involved in this manual to develop this, you know, consensus around some best management practices from a beginning cover crop user standpoint. The other thing I have just put up too is, and largely because it's fresh off the press, is the updated cover crop field guide. This is developed through the Midwest Cover Crops Council, and it's available for sale on the Purdue Extension Store's website. And it's, you know, it's just a handy little pocket guide, and I mean, it's probably 100 and some pages, but it's small enough that it still fits in. Yeah, it still fits in pockets. So we like that.
And I put the active links for both of those documents into the chat, so you can capture those that way. You can also visit our website and find that link as well. So as we're wrapping up here, feel free to get those questions in. I do have a few slides to share as well, because if you attended today for a CCA credit, please be sure to get me that information on the slide here. Essentially the name you used to watch the virtual field day today and your CCA number. Get that emailed to me at ejuchems at iastate.edu by 5 p.m. today, and I'll get your credits submitted on your behalf.
Hey Liz, can you slide your chat box off?
Whoops, sorry about that.
No
There we go.
problem.
Now you can see it. Okay, so that's getting that to me by 5. I'll put that in the chat as well. And then if you happen to live in Iowa and are interested in any edge of field practices such as a wetland or oxbow, saturated buffer, or bioreactor, you can also send that my way and I'll help connect you with the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. And we hope that you join us again in 2022 as we continue to weave in virtual field days to our in-person outreach. And our next one will be on January 13th at 1 p.m. here Central Time. And we'll be focusing on raised roads and wetlands, so strategies to deal with excess water and nutrients up in Northeast Iowa. So we can mark your calendar there. We also have more coming up in February and March as well. So let's see if we've got any more questions coming in here. I don't, but I'll give folks a few more minutes as I put in the CCA contact information.
Liz, I was wondering if there's anyone out there who has been planting green and has had success. I guess they can't tell us, but maybe they can just type it in the question. So
yeah, or that you are able to unmute. So if you'd like to hop in and
I was wondering what other people's experiences have been planting green. It's easier when they're all sitting on hay bales on a wagon, then I can see them.
looks like Jack, did you want to speak up?
Hi, this is Jack from Canada. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, hi Jack.
Okay. I am from Southern Alberta. We have 11 and a half months of winter and 2 weeks to pour sledding. I'm looking for a 40-day corn. We grow 73-day corn. Okay, due to the fact of August frost, and then if we hit an early frost, we're sunk. This year we didn't have a frost till late September, and corn yields were just astounding. Silage corn. We use many producers use cereal wheat for silage, then go a fall rye, the hybrid fall rise. The European hybrid fall rise, much improved over the old North American varieties. And then we silage that again and we seed in oats, and we get 3 crops in 2 years.
Wow.
And that scenario even beats corn. So while we love corn silage for palatability, weed control, etc., we are not there season wise. It's already gambling to grow corn. No, we're not that kinky yet.
Yeah. Wow.
Sounds like a really fun system.
Thanks for sharing, Jack. Anyone else? Nope.
It is harder on a virtual platform, so I agree. Some benefits, some drawbacks.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's all the questions I have for both of you. So thank you so much for participating today and for the virtual recording. Thank you all for tuning in today, and have a very safe and happy holidays.